Moments away from the last of 5 big earnings reports out of the world of technology we're covering this hour. We're waiting for Apple to report its figures. Alphabet, Google's parent company, had a blowout number. Amazon's numbers were very, very impressive. Apple, in the after-hours trading, is just about flat after running up like the rest of these tech stocks in the regular session. So our panel with Aaron, Gary B., Lance, and Scott are all with us, and we will get to Susan Lee in the newsroom as soon as the figures cross. Lance was talking about a little bit, or was talking a little before the break, guys, about what he was looking for. We're going to look at services, obviously the iPhone. Maybe we look next quarter rather than this quarter because the 12 is just out. What, Scott, would you add to that in terms of what you're looking for Apple here?
Something we may not get, but something that I think is important to think about when you're buying Apple stock here, as we have been, which actually speaks to something that Gary B. and Lance talked about at the beginning of the show, Apple Search. Apple Search is on the basically forefront of what we're going to see, I think, in Apple going forward in 2021. And they took a guy from Google about 3 years ago with respect to developing what they thought was going to be AI and some Siri stuff. But in reality, I think they were building out some Apple Search. They did an update on the latest iOS that changed some of the search features. If anybody noticed that was kind of a little bit of a secretive thing that they did that's different now on the latest iOS update. So to me, yeah, it's the 5G super cycle and things like that, Connell. But I think Apple Search is really key going forward because that actually goes back to what Gary B. and Lance were saying about that's the kind of thing that could take over some of those things that Gary B. was talking about that he's so hooked into Google about. Suddenly Apple could start being a player in a lot of that Hangouts, pictures, all that stuff that they look to do when they do similar things that Google's doing today so well.
All right. Aaron, I'll get to you first after the numbers are released. If history is any guide, it's any second now. 70 cents a share is the expectation on revenue of $63.7 billion for Apple. And here they come as they cross the wires. Susan, what do we see?
All in all, strong quarter. Let's get through it. Profit beating 73 cents for the quarter. Analysts are calling for 70 cents. A beat also when it comes to sales. 64.7 billion is what they made in those 3 months. Analysts were penciling in something closer to 63.7. Now, they saw an all-time record in the September quarter for Mac sales and services. Let's take you through the segments. iPhones came in at 26.44 billion, slightly less than anticipated for the quarter. Analysts were calling for 27.93 billion when it comes to iPhone revenue. iPad, a beat here, 6.797 billion, higher than analyst forecasts, calling for something a little bit over 6 billion. Mac, here you go. Take a look at this record number for Mac sales, 9 billion, and that's the work from home, educate from home trend that's helping Mac sales. Again, record quarter for Mac sales. Analysts were calling for something closer and under 8 billion. Now, wearables, again, this is a fast-growing division. A beat here, 7.876 billion for the quarter. Wearables, analysts were calling for something closer to 7.5, and services, again, another strong quarter here for Apple Watch and the other wearables in that division, and also for the services division, which includes Apple TV and music. Now, let's get through the Tim Cook comments. I just got off the phone with the CEO of Apple, the largest company in the world, and when it comes to that iPhone revenue miss in September, he says if you actually take out the quarter and split it up before mid-September and after, you saw customer demand was growing double digits, and so that's an enormous momentum, far beyond what we would have guessed or estimated. What about the 5G super cycle and the new iPhone 12? This is a big one for Apple, probably the most important iPhone launch in years. And he says, I can tell you that we're off to a great start, and I couldn't be happier with how they're going. I've only got 5 days of data. Now, as for the September quarter itself, he says we set an all-time record for the Mac, all-time record for services. We set a September quarter record for wearables. We set quarter records in Americas, Europe, Asia Pacific, India had a great September quarter, thanks in part to a strong reception to their new online store launch there. And Greater China, this is important because China represents around 20% of their sales, beat our internal expectations. Now, what about the wearables, the iPad? He says we're also very positive response to that September announcement of the Apple Watch Series 6. I see the iPad 8th generation, the iPad Air, and yes, we do tomorrow. We'll ship Apple One, which is that services bundle that you can buy buy one and get all of our services, and we're on target to ship Apple Fitness Plus before the end of the year. What about the U.S. economy broadly and stimulus? Tim Cook says, I continue to be optimistic here. I do think that a stimulus package is needed, and I would encourage everyone to work together on that. But I'm fairly confident that if that can occur, that we can continue this bounce back that we saw last quarter, with that GDP number that we saw today was quite good. And finally, what about the work from home trend? He says, I think it's going to be a little while. It'll be balanced across the winter with people being assigned more. I think you can kind of see that in the cases now. And so I would encourage everybody to follow the health professionals' advice so that we can all work together to get rid of ourselves of this thing. Now, cash equivalents, guys, $192 billion in gross cash. I would say all in all, pretty strong quarter.
Interesting, as always, to get the insight there in that phone conversation, Susan, that you had with Tim Cook. What would you say about his tone, especially on the kind of the state of the world? How does Tim Cook see things right now? What did you take away from it?
Very optimistic. He encourages people to go out and vote and make your voice heard. Now, as I mentioned to you, maybe you saw a bit of a slight miss when it comes to the iPhone, but don't forget you had tough comparables from last year when the iPhone 11 was launched on September 20th. Now, yes, the 5G iPhone 12 is a little bit late, so comparables are a little bit tough, and that's why you saw a bit of a miss when it comes to the iPhone sales segment. But I would still say it was a very strong quarter. You saw that work from home trend. People stuck at home. They're buying Macs. They're listening to Apple Music, and they're watching Apple TV, and they're educating from home, and hence you had the other hardware device picking up the slack from the iPhone.
Interesting. Good reporting, Susan, as always, on Apple. Better than expected, but the stock is down, Aaron Gibbs, by 4%. To repeat what Susan said at the beginning, they were expected to have $26.4 billion in revenue on the iPhone, and or that's what they delivered, I should say, when they were expected to have 27.9. So that was, you have 5 business segments that make up Apple. The iPhone miss, we know the timing of the iPhone 12 release. What do you take away from that?
Yeah, I think this might actually be a bit of an overreaction because Wall Street has been calling for Apple to have better diversification across its product lines and less dependency on the iPhone. So this incredible growth on wearable, Macs, and services is really exactly what Wall Street has been calling for. And these big beats in those areas, I think, are really positive. I'm not so worried about the miss on the iPhone for this quarter. As you know, it's delayed. Also, their next quarter, their first quarter, typically includes about 50% more revenue than any of the other 3 quarters of the year. So that's really the make or break quarter. And that's where we're really going to see those iPhone sales and whether that's really critical to making their yearly numbers. So I know they haven't been so great about giving us guidance, but I think I would sort of let them pass on missing those iPhone numbers for this quarter, and kudos to beating on all the other lines. That's really what Wall Street's been looking for.
By a lot, especially on that Mac number was huge at $9 billion, beat by over $1 billion. Lance, what would you say?
Well, I'm trying to imagine what would have happened if Apple had sort of looked back in time when the iPad and the Mac weren't doing so well, and if they had pulled back on innovation. Apple never did. They've stuck with them. They've worked those businesses, and they were primed for this moment. I mean, this unimaginable moment. And other companies are seeing this. These people who need new hardware, who need the iPads and need the Macs. So these numbers that growing this way are unsurprising. Also, the iPhone number is not even remotely surprising to me, because when you have the new phone delayed like that, it basically just people paused and waited, especially because they knew 5G was coming. I think maybe the estimates were too high there, so they were surprised by this number, but I'm not. And of course, yes, the next quarter is going to be huge for these new iPhones. And then we have, the incredible growth on the services side, which I'm, again, not really surprised about, but great moment to have right before the launch of Apple One, because that's really going to change how people perceive the collection of service offerings Apple has, including Apple Fitness, which is brand new. So it'll be really interesting to see how that potentially accelerates this part of business, which Tim Cook really wants. That's where they want to rely on more than the hardware like iPhones.
The stock's at about 110, give or take there, Scott. I guess it was up, 50 some odd percent this year coming in, and it's down 4.5%, 5% after hours. So would you buy more Apple here? What do you think of the stock?
Yeah, I would. I like this level here, Connell. We've been buying it kind of on this downdraft. You know, it's funny you mentioned 110. I mean, this stock was up close to, 130, 140 just a couple of months ago as we roll into this 5G rollout. So to me, yeah, Apple's got to be owned here going forward. I think the 5G super cycle may even take a couple months to really get going, but once it gets going, it's going to be self-sufficient. And then certainly going forward, too, I think you look at the services side of things, very strong. And I know I say this all the time, Connell, as you pointed out. I'm not afraid to admit one of my favorite things to do with my kids is play the Apple Arcade. If you haven't played the games on the Apple Arcade, as a 42-year-old man, they're fun to play just as they are for the kids that are in the 6 to 7, 8 years old range. I'm telling you.
At least you worked your kids into it this time, so actually that was we can give you a pass.
Yeah, I don't play those alone on a dark night. That's true. Fair enough.
That's another story. That is another story. Yeah, I wouldn't, as they used to say, I wouldn't have led with that. But that being said, we're not going to give you a hard time with your kids. But we go back the other way and go to Lance, who's next to me there in the boxes. From the technical point of view, what do you? Because we haven't talked about this yet. You held it up already. What do you think of the iPhone 12?
The 12 Pro, it's obviously it's their best iPhone ever. Apple may sometimes do incremental updates, and it's always making the iPhone better. But they actually did a big redesign here, went back to some classic look and feels, but integrated it with the True Depth module and their best screen ever. And yes, I think that people do want these new phones because the changes are big enough for them. Not only does it have the 3 cameras, it has a LiDAR sensor. And augmented reality, by the way, is a very big deal, not just for games, but for figuring out where you're going to put that piece of furniture in your house before you go out and buy it. And if you don't want to go out and take pictures because you don't want to leave your house, it's an important innovation for this stay-at-home world. So I like what Apple's done with these phones. They're beautiful. They're fun to use. And Apple is not disappointed on the innovation side. I like it.
No, that's always been the history there. And this one, of course, the 5G is what everybody talks about. But I wanted to get a little bit in, and thank you, Lance, to the specs of the phone itself. I guess, Aaron, the big thing now for Apple, and you guys have all been singing its praises, understandably so, because there's a lot of strength in this number with the iPhone sales taken out. There is a fair amount of pressure now, right, on the company for that holiday quarter that you mentioned earlier.
Right. It's really about that Q1 for them, the holiday period, where, like I said, in general, they're talking about 50% more revenue than any of the other 3 quarters in the year. So whether people are going to continue to spend on technology, and as we've still seen, a surprising amount of positive consumer spending, even with increasing unemployment numbers and potential, new lockdowns, those gadgets and your phone could be that one big spend that you're willing to spend, particularly with the big enhancements. We've complained about, people holding their iPhones longer. There's a longer turnover cycle. And it really takes more for someone to be willing to switch their phones. We all know you lose a day of switching into a new phone and just, moving all your data onto one phone from the other and reorganizing it. So there is that hurdle. But I think this one, Apple has certainly tried to show that they've really offered enough enhancements to make it worthwhile.
You sound, Aaron, like one of those people who doesn't back up your phone enough. You got to make sure you back it up, and then it's easier to move it over, on the other side, right?
I do, but it
I just switched my iPad over, and it was about 30 minutes.
This is free advice that we give out. Free advice. Oh, the widgets are, those widgets are actually pretty cool. Let me bring up Amazon for a moment. We could keep talking about Apple as well, but circle back, Scott, to the beginning of the hour. Amazon's figures are just, kind of eye-popping when you talk about just the overall numbers of 90-some-odd billion in sales. That was a record, by the way, the 96 billion in sales. On AWS, and I think you were one of the ones who brought that up at the beginning, Amazon Web Services, what would you say about that part of the business? 11.6 billion in revenue was the figure at AWS, up 29% year over year, better than expected. And the positioning there, because that kind of brings the conversation when we compare these companies, the big 5 we've been talking about, to each other, Amazon, Google, and others, and that cloud business. Obviously, Microsoft, not today, but it's the other big one there. AWS has been some sort of a juggernaut during this stay-at-home period.
AWS is the most exciting component of any of those companies' earnings that you mentioned so far, including Microsoft, in my opinion. AWS is the future of Amazon, boys and girls. I'm telling you, it's not their retail business. I mean, the information and the money that they're getting in to AWS and the revenues, I mean, those are exactly what the future of this company is going to be about. Now, whether they spin that off going forward, because it is going to get so huge, is the question. I'm not so much worried about that today as a stockholder and one that's going to keep buying Amazon here. But if you just look at that growth, as you noted, Connell, and AWS, since its infancy, the numbers are absolutely astounding, and there's no reason to believe that that's going to stop anytime soon and not keep propelling the stock higher.
Would you buy more Amazon? I asked you the same thing about Apple, Scott. What about Amazon stock? Because that's really run up.
Yeah, I would. I love pullbacks, though. So if we get a pullback around the election or any kind of things that come out that may knock the stock down, I'd rather buy it on a down day, not a day maybe like tomorrow. But yeah, I think you got to keep accumulating here.
These 5 companies, the stat I just saw across on the wires, are about 20% of the market cap of the S&P 500, which is crazy. Aaron, in terms of stocks, and we've seen different reactions today given what had happened in the regular session today. You know, some are pulling back off of highs and all the rest. Do you like these stocks at these levels?
So I still like Amazon, but I guess I also love a sale. And so if you see any negative numbers around maybe hesitancy around holiday sales that pushes the stock down, I'd say use that to jump in. And same thing, I think this is actually an opportunity for Apple to buy if the stock continues to go down by tomorrow morning. So I think those are 2 very strong. Plus, they've got just such strong balance sheets. We know that even if they face a couple quarters of downturn, if we do see a dip in GDP in the U.S., they're going to easily be able to weather it. And we're just continuing to see growth in AWS and Google as well. It's all about those cloud services. We're seeing a long-term trend in growth in cloud services. And even though there's more competition with Microsoft coming into the play, there's still room for all of these companies to grow. And the margins are off the charts, and they're contributing over 50% of profits. So those are my top 3.
So we were very busy, or she's been very busy, I should say, Susan Lee, on these conference calls with various executives throughout the hour. We heard moments ago what Tim Cook had to say. I know, Susan, you just got off the Alphabet call with the CFO.
Yeah.
What did you hear there?
That's right. So Ruth Porat, and this is a great quarter for her to talk about since they crushed estimates here with revenue and sales up 14%. And Porat, when I asked her about the election and political ads and how the fact that they are banning all political ads after election night, how that might impact the bottom line, she says we have quite an army of people focused on what we call trust and safety and really focus on protecting the quality of content. And we've been doing the work for quite some time to be ready for the election. So we're quite focused, as Sundar said yesterday in that Senate Commerce hearing, and we are ready. We've done a lot of work to be in that position. Now, what about that antitrust case that was filed by the DOJ last week, contending that Alphabet has way too much control when it comes to search and online advertising? And I asked her if there's going to be an overhang like what Microsoft went through in the late 1990s and early 2000s. And she says, look, our view on that DOJ case is that it's deeply flawed, and people use Google because they choose to, not because they are forced to or because they can't find alternatives. And so now our legal team is focused on that, and the company is very focused on delivering for users and businesses. Now, remember, Connell, last quarter around, Alphabet actually saw its first sales decline in the company's history. So this is the fact that they crushed it in those 3 months up to September. I think that's very encouraging.
Crushed it indeed, and the stock's off to the races, up 9%. Scott, you want to take that political risk question when Susan's reporting on some of those comments on the election and also on antitrust? I thought, Sundar Pichai kind of escaped the worst of it, but that was on a relative basis with Jack Dorsey and a little bit of Mark Zuckerberg yesterday. But what about Google and the risk of politics?
Yeah, there's risk there. I mean, from anybody watching yesterday's commentary or question and answer, whatever you want to call that, dog fight, cat fight. I mean, there's risk there. I mean, yeah, I guess they're lucky that that the Google's lucky that Zuckerberg and Dorsey were on the call, because that took a lot of the emphasis, I think, off the company. But that's the thing. I mean, that's really the question going forward, too. I mean, if you go into the political space, and depending on what happens, too, in a matter of days, that could change the tone as well. So you have to factor that in as an investor to these companies. I think it's worse, maybe a little bit more for some of the Facebooks and the Twitters because they're under a little bit more of the heat lamp than maybe Google is going forward. But there's also that willingness, though, as I've seen the companies do so far, and we've seen this going on for years. I mean, this isn't the first political issue these guys have had. They tend to do okay and come out okay when it comes to getting in front of Congress. So I don't think that's going to change, but it's just something you have to consider going forward that could affect the stocks at points. But those are buying opportunities, in my opinion.
So how do you consider it then, Aaron, if the Democrats sweep into power and take, all three branches, does a lot of that risk then suddenly go away, or do the companies will they be under pressure no matter what the regime in Washington is? How do you look at it in terms of it on the investment side?
Well, Google's a little different because it has its antitrust issues, and then it also has sort of the bias and manipulation issues. I think they're by far in the safest place, and we saw that in the congressional hearings. It really, when it comes to bias manipulation, they're in a safe space, and they're pretty good at handling it. It's really about antitrust, and that is where they might be more vulnerable if we have a full Democratic sweep. When you're talking about Facebook and Twitter, more of the social medias, where it's really about bias, manipulation, blocking, that type of thing, I think that would continue regardless of who's in power. And so I don't think that risk is going to shift with Democrats or Republicans. And they're going to be in the front lines and have heavier political risk versus Google. Even with antitrust, there's probably a lot of ways that they can get around it in order to maintain their dominancy.
All right. I actually do have to finally wrap this up. That was great coverage by all of you guys. Thanks so much, Lance and Scott, Aaron, Susan Lee, all over it. We had Gary B. and Lauren earlier in the hour as well. The Big Five are in from the world of technology. Thank you all. Now, the reason we have to wrap it up and move on.